another webinar here at Nurse Recruitment Experts. I'm thrilled to be joined by Brandi Vines, who I spoke to a couple of weeks ago, and I enjoyed our conversation so much I wanted to bring her back on for a bit of a longer show. So I'm going to let Brandi introduce herself, and then we're going to jump into today's topic. So over to you, Brandi.
Awesome. Well, Adam, thanks for having me on. So, Brandi Vines, I have been in healthcare operations and staffing for about 22 years, and much of that being in leadership positions within large staffing companies here in the United States.
Okay, great. And today, Brandi, we're going to talk over your nurse recruitment insights, get some analysis and expertise from you. I was wondering, could you give us a bit of background on your career so people can understand where you're going to be kind of getting your knowledge from?
Yeah, no, of course. So, within the 22 years that I've been in healthcare, the journey's kind of taken me in multiple different directions. So started in pharmaceuticals. So CVS pharmacy manager, really learning the ropes of everything from billing, dealing with payers and different kind of drug indications. And that led its way into Pfizer Pharmaceutical, where I had a short stint there before actually transitioning over into AMN Healthcare. Got to meet some leaders in the Dallas AMN market. So went to AMN staffing, ended up being a vice president there over a large production group there. So then after a good stint at AMN Healthcare, I did some support for Cross Country Staffing, another large staffing company in the United States, and helped them with their locums and advanced practice space and really get that business off the ground for them. And spent the last 8+ years with HCA Healthcare and Health Trust, building about 5 different service lines, everything from travel nursing, interim leadership, locums, you name it, within the staffing space for the largest healthcare system in the nation. So now then I'm taking that experience and knowledge and doing some coaching and consulting and a couple of other things that I'm really excited about that I'll be announcing here pretty soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Nurse recruitment experts, we're trying to bring on more experts, and you've certainly crossed the kind of variety of roles and positions. It's interesting for me that you started out in staffing, then you worked for HCA to help them set up kind of their own staffing function. So I'd love to ask a little bit about that, because I'm seeing it more and more. In-house teams are creating their own contingent workforce management and planning that because they want to cut down on agencies. Do you have any tips for someone who is considering that or would like to set something like that up themselves?
Yeah, I think it's really knowing your strengths and weaknesses as a healthcare system. No healthcare system is the same, and not even any one hospital is the same. So you can have this entire healthcare system, and one particular hospital within your system has a completely different pain point than the other. So really knowing that first is the first goal, because it can't be, in my opinion, a very cookie cutter approach, because depending on what those pain points are will really help determine what your strategy needs to be to go about the appropriate staffing model. But once you've discerned that, then it's really, discerning the right partnerships. For example, if you've got, your staffing is running really well for the most part at a particular hospital, but you're just really struggling in your OR. Well, then you need to figure out those right relationships to have that direct relationships with someone who can help in that arena. You may have some other areas, like, I'm in the Dallas-Fort Worth market, and if you have, a large metropolitan area, you may be better off with a more traditional VMS MSP support model, because then you're looking at everything from med surg telemetry and your kind of mainstream house level positions within your staffing. So I think it just really depends on what's going on in your healthcare system. So that's the first step, discerning that, and then from there doing the research and figuring out the right partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And it seems to be working well for HCA, and it seems like a concept that we could be seeing more of in the future. So it's really interesting that you were one of the first to help set that up. I'd like to jump a little bit more into kind of general questions around nurse recruitment. So I was reading Becker's Healthcare Review, big healthcare industry news site. They asked about 91 executives, CNOs, CEOs, CFOs who are attending their upcoming conference, what are their top priorities? And I found a few points that are relevant to nurse staffing. The first one of the executives said they're focusing on building a pipeline of candidates through nursing schools. And I'm wondering if you have any advice or experience on how hospitals can do that better.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I find very frequently with a lot of the hospital systems I've partnered with is they want to go out and talk to these nurses that are graduating, and they start the relationship process their last year in school or last semester even. And they want to come have this relationship with them and convince them to come work for their hospital system, but they haven't invested the time since they enter nursing school to get to know them and what their focus and studies is. So the hospital systems I see do this the best from the time that person even says, I want to go to nursing school. They are keeping in touch with them for years throughout nursing school and really encouraging them through the process. So they're there already supporting them. Then even more important, making sure when they get ready for those clinical rotations, they're offering those clinical rotations at their facilities. So they're being able to come in and kind of try before you buy, right? It's like trying a shoe on to make sure it's the right fit. So more often than not, by the time a nurse is getting through their clinical rotations, if a hospital's done a good job of really partnering with them, getting to know them throughout their entire tenure in nursing school, by the time they get to those clinical rotations and they're doing those clinical rotations in the hospital in which has been investing a relationship into that nurse, by the time they get to those clinical rotations, they get finished with the clinical rotation. Like, okay, sign me up. As soon as I graduate, I'm coming here. And so I think a lot of hospital systems that they're trying to tap into that pipeline of new grads coming out into the market, they're too late. They're coming into it that last semester or last year. And they, again, you get what you put into something, right? And so I think that's where, my observance is the hospital systems that do it the best. They're with those nurses from the time that they even show interest at all in being a nurse. And so that's a long sales cycle, right? You're talking years of investment, but I think that's what, nurses right now, they want to know who really cares about me as a nurse and me being clinically, a very competent, good nurse once I come out of school.
Yeah. Building those long-term relationships sounds so vital for this. And when it comes to the school administrators, is there anything that health systems can do to partner with them or get them on side, or do they have to kind of go for the relationships with the students themselves?
No, I think you go directly to the administrators from my experience, because even I, had a lot of really good relationships with administrators across colleges, and they want their nurses to be supported. They don't want to, every college, doesn't matter what, industry it is that the person's focusing on their schooling, they want to make sure when their students graduate that they immediately become successful and that they get a job and they're well employed. And so they have a vested interest. I think you'll find that, a lot of, college administrators are very much, especially your admissions office, they want to partner with hospitals, even staffing companies, people that want to really make sure that those nurses are taken care of. One of the things that I worked a lot, with the colleges that I partnered with was kind of painting this big picture of nursing for life. When they come out, do you want to be a staff nurse? Do you eventually 5 years from now want to travel? And do you want to be in leadership? And if you do, how do we start grooming and nurturing that from the time you step into the hospital clinically and start getting in that mindset of grooming you for leadership? So painting this picture like, hey, we're a one-stop shop, as a staffing agency, and want to come in and make sure your nurse, regardless of where they're at in their career, that they know that we can be there to support them along that journey.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because the schools are going to be judged by success rate of their graduates.
Yeah, absolutely.
I like that approach. So when you touched upon staffing there, another point I saw on the survey was managing a contingent workforce, and some were mentioning how they wanted to find innovative approaches to doing it, and then others were just talking about how do we cut down our spend on travelers. Do you have any suggestions or visions for the future of how health systems can better manage their contingent nursing workforce going into the next few years?
Yeah, well, I think, you and I talked about this briefly already about, just tapping into your international nurses for your perm staff. That's the first thing, right? Like if you're looking at just a cut spend in its entirety, it goes back to pipelining, which is going to be your schools, the walking billboards, your nurses and your patients, making sure you are doing a great job of recruiting through your staff and your patients to have people come work there. And then working on an international nursing strategy as well to get more nurses to your particular hospital. So that's the first thing. I think doing a lot more local staffing versus true travel national staffing it's more economical. So if you can do, and a lot of that goes into some of the big tech players, and where they've got really good technology to help with bridge that gap of the introduction of the nurse to the hospital in those local markets. That's not going to make sense for everybody. I mean, again, going back to the pain point of every hospital is different. That's going to work well for a hospital that's in a metropolitan area. If you're the hospital in Derry, New Hampshire, that may not be the right strategy for you because there's not a plethora of nurses, to build that local market. When you go to true national staffing, traditional travel nursing, one of the things, there are actually two different things that I would recommend. One, housing. The cost of living across the United States is getting so expensive. And a lot of nurses don't even want to do traveling anymore because by the time that they take that housing subsidy and pay it towards whatever apartment or hotel that they're going to rent, it's not worth it financially for them to be on the road. So be a true partner with the staffing agencies you're working with. You're local. So if you're that hospital in Derry, New Hampshire, you know how to get more economical housing. You may have different options that you could offer up to whatever nurses are going to come to your market and actually reduce your bill rate. So instead of paying $85 an hour for a nurse, you may get away with a $70 an hour bill rate, but provide housing. So then it becomes more lucrative for both the nurse and it becomes more financially affordable for the hospital system. I've seen in some large markets this also working well, where if as a hospital system that you're always going to have 20, 30 contract labor nurses in the market, doing 12-month leases on apartments and having them ready to go, because again, that's the other problem with nursing. Nurses come in, if they want to have an apartment, they're going to have that surcharge on a short-term lease. Whereas if a hospital already has a 12-month contract out on a lease, it reduces the cost per month. So that's a way that they can absolutely come alongside. Again, being a partner. I keep using the word a lot, partner, because I feel like to a large degree, with hospital systems and staffing, there hasn't been a lot of strategy throughout the pandemic. So it's being more strategic right now and figuring out how we, can partner equally, staffing companies and hospital systems, to figure out how to reduce those costs. The other thing, Adam, that I have seen a lot of as of late, is this we're still in this whack-a-mole approach of staffing. So what I mean by that is we'll offer a nurse a 13-week contract in the United States. And the second that we see on the P&L that we need to cut costs, we cancel that nurse. Well, maybe that nurse was only there for 4 weeks. Okay, just like an HR hat, when you think about the cost of onboarding for perm staff, it's no different with contract labor. If you get a nurse in for 4 weeks, what did you really get out of that expense? By the time they got up to speed, oriented to the hospital, really hopefully they already know your EMR, but even if they already know your EMR, do they know your hospital? It's something totally different than just your EMR. So my recommendation is taking a step back and stop thinking short-sighted, think more long-term. If you're doing a forecast and I'm 10 FTE short in this department, you're not going to have 10 new perm staff nurses in the next month, right? Unless you have just this awesome recruiting strategy. So you're better to take 2, 3, whatever the right number is, and potentially even do longer contracts. Have nurses come in, but do a 6-month contract so that there's not this retraining. You get a higher level of productivity out of the nurse that you're bringing in because they're more bought into the healthcare system, and you're not doing this cycling. The amount of times I've seen a hospital system bring in 4 travel nurses, cut the 4 travel nurses, then 3 weeks later, guess what? They're ordering 4 more travel nurses. And so you're doing this like back and forth, and that doesn't help. That also impacts your staff morale because you have this constant cycling, staff where they don't know the fellow nurse that they're handing off their patients to. Then also your patient satisfaction. Your patients, sometimes your patients are in the hospital for weeks. And if you have this constant cycle of staff, you don't have that patient care continuity. That can also be of concern. So that's the other recommendation is, thinking more long-term, doing that predictive analytics to look forward to figure out what your census is going to be, comparing that to your core staff and what you're short, so you can do a better job of forecasting what you're really going to need in contract labor and having a more committed model to it, because it will increase your productivity.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like what you're describing, plugging holes and then just managing things off a spreadsheet instead of considering the longer term outcomes for patients or the organization as a whole.
Right.
Whenever you mention longer term contracts, then how could systems best promote those? Would that be through staffing providers? They would say, here we have a 6-month contract instead of the standard 13 weeks, or would that be direct with nurses?
Yeah, I think that's them going to the staffing agencies that they work with, and even trying to be like, hey, like if we're doing a more committed model, can we get a reduction in the bill rate, right? Like in doing that partnership, it's a yin and yang, right? You make sure that you're, partnering together. You see that a lot through, seasonality with hospital systems where they will forecast for flu season. Now we're going to have a COVID season. I don't know if that's going to become a thing, but it seems to be just continuous. But looking at your year over year, quarter over quarter, figuring out what the census is really looking like in your hospitals. And again, not thinking short-sighted to the P&L this month, thinking of, what that long-term play is going to look like realistically within each department, and then making a determination off of that. But yeah, I think it can absolutely be partnering with staffing agencies that you already know and trust. It's just, saying, hey, here's what we're thinking. Instead of ordering 6 travel nurses right this second, we're going to do 3. But I'd rather do 3 for 6 months. Let's get them in here. Let's get them part of, our system and make them, kind of bought in, and make sure that there are 3 nurses that will come in and, like I said, really jump in and increase the productivity and delivery to the patient care.
If you've been excited or interested in what Brandi just said, if you're a podcast listener, her name is Brandi Vines. You can find her on LinkedIn, because I think that you could bring a lot of value to organizations that are really scratching their heads on how to best handle this. Before we move on, Derry, New Hampshire was where the first potato in the United States was planted. I know that because the settlers were from Northern Ireland, where I'm from. There's a town here called Derry.
I learned something new today.
Yeah, no, I just get distracted by history things. That's my background. So we're going to talk a little bit about retention now. So the executives I read, they were saying we want to improve retention. We want to manage our talent better through technology, incentives, working patterns, and also improve their engagement and get them committed to a shared sense of purpose and values. And I think for a lot of people, this seems difficult to implement because it's not so tangible as offering increased wage or sign-on bonus. It's trying to get people to sign up to a common worldview and a sense of purpose. So I'd love to hear how you see that potentially happening and any experiences you've had in the past of making it happen.
Yeah. The first step is starting, right? I think a lot of people talk about retention and trying to increase morale in your staff, but they never actually launch something. There's a committee for a committee to a committee for nothing to happen. So, the first step of starting is doing the assessment. You have to be open to real, raw, candid feedback. I tell everybody, even your biggest critic, someone who, maybe even your arch enemy, if it's someone that gives you feedback, even their feedback, you got to take that step back and figure out, okay, what morsel little nugget of this has validity to how we can improve the way that we go about supporting our staff. So going back to your feedback, most hospitals, they do have employee engagement surveys or something of that nature, but I would question, every HR leader in our hospital systems, how effective are those employee engagement surveys? Are they actually getting to the core of what the issues are? I think most often, than not, those employee engagement surveys, they're pretty superficial. And a lot of times the questions, at least from what I've seen in multiple hospital systems, they're not very targeted. So the questions they can be ambiguous to where when you get the feedback, you can't really dissect it to figure out what the real problem is. I encourage unit directors, sit down, SurveyMonkey. You can get on SurveyMonkey, create a survey in 10 seconds and make it very targeted to what it is that you need to know as a unit leader as far as what the true issues are. So that's the first step. You've got to figure out what the issues are. I think you're going to hear a lot of staffing. A lot of the issue is going to be staffing. We're overworked, productivity expectations. I come to a unit. I'm concerned for my license. I've got too many patients, and I'm got an elopement risk over here, and another one who, the patient's deteriorating, and all of a sudden they're a higher acuity, need to be transitioned to a higher acuity unit. Like it keeps coming at them. So I think that's going to be a large portion of what you hear. But then you've got to take that, whatever feedback that you get, and you've got to come up with a strategy. You've got to come up with a plan to be truly supportive in those situations. Every hospital and healthcare staffing company, for the most part, has some type of clinical leader involved. A lot of times in our staffing industry, it's your clinical liaison team. You have a CNO, clinical director, somebody that's there for that clinical knowledge base. And then, of course, just within your hospital, you've got everybody from your clinical leaders within the unit all the way up to your CNO. And so the question is when they have those issues, what is the escalation process? To me, a lot of this comes back to communication. And so when you have that concern on a unit where you're understaffed, or you have again, like the example, that's real life. You could be a med tele nurse, and all of a sudden, a patient start deteriorating. Now you have a patient that immediately needs to go over to critical care. And what is that communication? What is the chain of events that needs to happen to say, raise the red flag? How do I get help right now so that I feel supported as a nurse? So I think coming up with communication processes for when a nurse gets into those situations where they feel uncomfortable with the current staffing situation is crucial right now for nurses to being heard. So when you start talking about retention, a lot of it's really, it boils down to getting the feedback. And then from when you get the feedback, start discerning what the process is going to look like to help, fulfill those pain points. And again, communicating and being transparent, coming back and say, hey guys, we surveyed this entire department. 80% of you said XYZ. So we've heard you. This is where we're going to put our effort and focus right now. The other thing on that, Adam, is a lot of times leaders, I'm guilty as charged. I've done this. We see a problem and we think we know how to fix it. So we just go about fixing something and we roll out a new process or something to an entire group, but we never even got the feedback of the people who said this is the problem. So I encourage any clinical leader within a unit, CNOs, et cetera, even your HR channels, incorporate your staff into those decisions, because even if they say 80% say that this is the problem, you may come up with a solution that to the 80% that said that that's a problem, it may not really resonate with what they think is going to fix the issue. So make sure that, and I hate to use the word committee, but you need a committee. You need to pull your staff level nurse that are saying that this is the problem, pull them into the solution. I think you'll be surprised with how many amazing ideas that they actually bring to the table. Because generally speaking, I think people, want to have a good working environment. People don't like to come into work and hate their job. So I think if you pull them into that process, you can really get some buy-in from each staff level nurse to be part of the solution. Instead, because right now what I hear a lot of is just, I hate to say it, but grumbling, right? There's a lot of nurses grumbling versus being pulled into part of the solution.
Yeah, and that's fine, and it's natural for them, I think, to behave like that if there's no opportunity for them to feel a part of it.
Absolutely.
So I think what on our end is we're focusing on the recruitment of talent, and we see that as well. So we make sure anyone who goes for an interview, we get feedback from them and ask them how they viewed the process and what could be improved about it. So when it comes to recruiting nurses, I think doing this every step of the way, recruitment, retention, before they leave, after they leave, is the most important thing to listen to, rather than coming up with ideas yourselves in a closed office.
Well, and Adam, I'm going to go back to like clinical liaisons on the staffing side. There's a lot of staffing companies that do have clinical liaison, clinical departments that help support the contract labor nurses as they're out there. But to a large degree, it's more risk mitigation. And, they're there to help, if something goes wrong. Whereas I feel like where staffing companies can kind of raise the bar is really making sure that those clinical liaisons they're a partner. So I'm going to go back to those examples where a nurse calls their recruiter, says, I'm canceling contract. I'm walking out right now. This place is a disaster. There's no support. Instead of just calling it quits, again, I'm going to go back to the cost of orienting any nurse, regardless if they're contract labor or a perm nurse. There's a cost associated with that. So what can you do to salvage that contract? So at that point in time, having your clinical liaisons really have a strong partnership with whatever clinical leaders are at that hospital to really say, okay, hey, here's what the nurse is saying. Like, let's work through this. What's something we can do to help provide this nurse more support in this area to make sure we can salvage this contract and relationship versus having to start over? Because if that nurse walks out, that's what you're doing. You're going to start over by figuring out what either another travel nurse or perm nurse is going to come in there to backfill that nurse walking out. So again, going back to the retention, I think that's where, to a large degree, staffing agencies can elevate the game is, really challenging their clinical teams that they have to be a more part of the solution of retention.
Yeah. Okay. And I know we're short on time, so if anybody wants to get in touch with you to talk about that a little bit more, or any of the other topics you've covered, how can they reach you?
Yeah, so I live on LinkedIn. You can always, message me on LinkedIn, or equally email me. We have our new website, the Covalent Culture. It's covalentculture.com. And so that's where you can also reach out. I do a lot of, again, coaching and consulting right now. And if you want to schedule any time for any further conversations, I do offer a free consultation. If you can go on the website, you can offer that free, sign up for that free consultation, and we can figure out how it could be of help. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Brandi. And again, I'd encourage anyone who wants to have a chat with Brandi, reach out to her. She's a real expert in this field and can share a lot of knowledge with you. So appreciate you coming on, Brandi. And tune in to our upcoming podcasts and webinars. We've got a few great guests lined up. You can just follow Nurse Recruitment Experts on LinkedIn to see our upcoming events when they are launched. And if you want to learn more about what we do, search nurserecruitmentx.com. We are offering a free trial where you get 3 nurses for free, so we can show you how we can amplify your nurse recruitment. So that's all for this week. Thank you so much, Brandi, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon. Bye.
Thanks, Adam. Bye.
Cheerio.